Unit 5, Functionalism's Conceptualization of Qualia. Section 1, Functionalism's Definitions of Qualia. One mainstream theory of mind, functionalism, does make some effort to account for qualia. Its core idea is that mental states, beliefs, desires, being in pain, and other qualia are constituted solely by their functional role. In other words, mental states act as, or simply are, causal relations between other mental states, sensory inputs, and behavioral outputs. Functionalism focuses on processes at the level between physical operations in the brain and behavioral output. Since mental states are identified only by their functional role, they are said to be potentially realizable in a variety of systems, composed of any sorts of material. So, for example, according to functionalism, it should be possible for computers to have mental states, including qualia, as long as the system performs the appropriate functions. While computers are physical devices with electronic substrate that perform computations on inputs to give outputs, so brains are physical devices with neural substrate that perform computations on inputs which produce behaviors. Thus, in functionalism, a mental state can be compared to a valve in engineering. A valve can be made of plastic or metal or whatever material, as long as it performs its intended function of controlling the flow of a liquid through a tube by blocking and unblocking its pathway. So, according to functionalism, qualia are nothing but the functions, input, mechanism, output, by which they are supported. Functionalism may be willing to take into account the detailed circuitry of the brain that mediates between input and output as part of the full description of a function, but it does so only as circuitry. Quote, "The tissue out of which brain circuits are made, neurons, membranes, synapses, and so on, and the means by which the circuits operate, passage of impulses along axons, release of neurotransmitter into the synapse, etc., are regarded within functionalism as irrelevant. In principle, the functionalist holds one could mimic the circuitry with any material to hand, and the result, in terms of either conscious or unconscious processing, would be the same. Same functions, same processes. If the relevant brain process attains consciousness, so would the same function, no matter what material was used to carry it out." End quote from Gray. Gray concludes that functionalism makes the two following inferences about qualia. 1. For any discriminable difference between qualia, there must be an equivalent discriminal difference in function. And 2. For any discriminable functional difference, there must be a discriminable difference between qualia. Gray points out that there are, of course, many exceptions to this second complementary inference. Quote, There are many forms of behavior which are not accompanied by qualia at all. So, for example, the pupils of one's eyes constrict if illumination increases and dilate if it decreases, but one is not normally aware of either of these changes in pupil size. However, in the case of a behavioral domain which is normally accompanied by qualia, whenever functionalism draws the primary inference, it should also draw the complementary one." End quote. Gray then applies these inferences to seeing red and green. Quote, "If someone claims to have different red and green experiences, then there must be different functions, input mechanism output, to support this claim. The complementary inference would be that within the domain of color vision, if someone manifests different functions, then there must be different qualia accompanying them. The two inferences together constitute a claim for identity between qualia and functions within the domain of color vision. Functionalism at its strongest generalizes this identity claim across all qualia within each domain and all domains of conscious experience." End quote. Gray points out that the crux of the hard problem of consciousness lies in the phenomena of perception qualia. As an example, he considers the question, how should one explain the difference between two subjective experiences of color, say red and green? In answering this question, functionalism essentially ignores qualia. Instead, it focuses on, quote, "a repertoire of responses by which the experiencing individual demonstrates behaviorally the capacity to discriminate between red and green. This repertoire would include, e.g., pointing to a red-green color when requested to do so, using the word red-green appropriately in relation to the colors red and green, stopping, going at a red-green traffic light, stating that a lime is green and a tomato is red, and so on." End quote. If such a functional account is fully provided, then, quote, "according to functionalism, there is no further answer that can be given to the original question. What is the difference between the subjective experiences, the qualia, of red and green? To continue asking this question in the face of a complete functionalist account would, so the doctrine holds, be a meaningless activity." End quote.